Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to have a bit more of a philosophical and strategic video here in Victoria 3 regarding a kind of general mindset for approaching the game, but specifically approaching the game in the context of multiplayer or if you have other competent opponents, which is going to be more colonial oriented or more focused on building a power base than actually exercising that power base. This is going to be the central idea, and we are going to unpack it by taking a look at several other different games where I think this relationship is a lot more obvious and easy to convey, and I also think that relating other games back to Victoria 3 might be interesting, so we are going to be discussing a little bit of game theory to start, and then we are going to be discussing chess, maybe a little bit of Risk, which is probably the game that most promotes at a more competitive level. Risk most promotes a really passive gameplay style focused on accumulating power, and then we're going to talk about Magic the Gathering, specifically the four-player format of Magic the Gathering, and how the way you view resources in Magic the Gathering changes when you switch from 2 players to 4 players, and that this same type of change I think is appropriate when thinking of, trying to accumulate power in the great game of Victoria 3, where you have not just a single opponent, but many opponents are vying for, control or global control of what is going on, resources, pops, etc. And so let's get into it. Now, a 2-player game is significantly different than a multiplayer game in that whenever you attack the other player's resources, any damage you do to their resources is going to be of direct benefit to you because they are the power that you have to contend with. So if we have 2 players here, and they have each 7 resources available with which to combat their opponent, if you can at any point in time take your opponent's resources down to 5, at the expense of only 1 resource yourself, this is always going to be a good exchange for you, which means you are trading up in value. And this is intuitive, and when you fight a war in Victoria 3 and you win a war, this is much in how it goes in terms of just the relationship between your 2 players. You got something from them. Often multiplayer rule sets will involve preventing you from taking a ton of war goals from other players, and you had a really expensive war, but they also had a really expensive war. You both paid for a really expensive war. You both lost resources, but the person who had to give up the war goals, they lost a greater amount of resources than the person who ends up winning the war. And so in this sense, you come ahead. And in this kind of framework, or when you're thinking of it in this way, it is a zero-sum game, which is there is a finite amount of value, and anytime you acquire more advantage or more differential between the power level of you and your opponent in the kind of context we're looking at here, now there's a difference of 1 between our 2 nations, and we have gone from being equally strength to now being stronger by 1 point. In this sort of sense, we are now +1. And this is often how chess is scored, and it's very transparent in scoring of chess, and especially if you watch coverage of chess. But a zero-sum game is one in which any loss for your opponent is a similar or exact plus for you, and any plus for you is an equivalent to a loss for an opponent. And it's specifically that it involves 2 players when we are thinking of zero-sum games, because games change when you add more players. A really good example of a zero-sum game is chess, where anything that's good for you is bad for your opponent, and anything that's bad for your opponent is good for you. And so if we are going to be playing white here, whenever there's a plus score, that means white has a slight lead, or that white has an advantage, and whenever there's a negative score, black has an advantage, and the size of the score indicates the size of the advantage. Now, generally speaking, bishops are thought to be worth, roughly speaking, 3 pawns or 3 points, which is how evaluation is done in chess. If we give away our bishop here for nothing, we will lose the bishop, and suddenly the eval bar is -3, which is roughly the value of the bishop here, and we have lost it for nothing. But it's important to note the loss of the bishop itself is not the problem. The problem is that we have lost the bishop, and black has lost nothing. And so in Victoria 3, often when you have a really expensive war, you will have an expensive war, but your opponent will also have an expensive war. And so if we think of Victoria 3 in a zero-sum sort of sense, fighting a really expensive war for a single province, and then gaining that province, even if that province can't recoup the value, if you're thinking of it in a zero-sum sort of way, then it could be the case that it is still worth it, it. And so if we take a look at this sort of line here, which is kind of a little bit more of a standard line, if we take the knight here, we will lose our bishop, but we have gotten compensation in that we've gotten a knight, which is a similarly valued piece. It's worth slightly less than a bishop, but it's not that big a deal. And so here, often in Victoria 3, if you're just viewing something from a zero-sum sort of perspective, and kind of the more common one, or the most common war I've seen in multiplayer is either the Brothers' War, Prussia and Austria fighting, or if you're fighting France for Alsace-Lorraine, you guys both have a really expensive war. The winner gets the province, and it feels like you've won, and it feels like you've gotten something good. And if it were a zero-sum game, this would be the case. This would be the case if we're thinking of it in terms of chess being a zero-sum game, because we have, in some sense, traded a bishop for a knight, and then we've gotten one additional pawn. So a position like this is kind of a little bit similar to winning Alsace-Lorraine in a fight over France. We're both going to spend a ton in the war. We're both going to lose a piece. Here, white can win material. If you want to pause, you can pause and try and figure it out like a chess puzzle. I'll give you a second to pause. But here, we can trade value. We can think of this as having a great big war where we each lose 3 points of material, but then after the salvo, white gets to capture an additional pawn here, and white will be up around 1 point of material, or 1 pawn's worth of material, and black just kind of has to shrug it off. Now, if you're playing a two-player game, or a zero-sum game like this is an advantage, and you push it, and this is good. However, in Victoria 3, you have more than just 2 players. So Risk is a really good example where in multiplayer free-for-all Risk, you will see players play extremely passively. And the reason why is that even though you can trade resources and attacking favors the attacker in terms of the math on the dice, you will see that in most turns of high-level Risk, there is only one singular province that gets taken. You can see here blue did go after purple in order to break up their bonus of the continents, and this is the main reason why you would go for more provinces in these types of scuffles, or to push someone out of a given area. But for the most part, if we just watch through here, just kind of the first option we could find on looking for free-for-all, we will see a lot of turns where just a single province is taken, and then they fortify back. And the reason for this is, a better way to think of Risk is you are trying to accumulate an overall troop count, and this troop count represents an ability for you to defeat the entire table. When you fight someone else, you may diminish their power by more than you diminish yours, because the attacker has an advantage in terms of the dice, but as you both lose power in terms of troop count, you decrease both of your chances of being able to win against the entire rest of the table. And the reason for this is you are trying to be thinking about accumulating bonuses, and instead what you're looking at is how many troops per turn are we getting. And if you can have more troops per turn, if you hit a critical point and have more troops per turn than the rest of the table, then you can kind of turn the corner and look to finish off the rest of the table. Or if you have so much troops that you can secure a position where you're getting more troops per turn, you can beat the rest of the table. So often at the very highest level, it turns into this hyper-weighting game where the players that are going to have a slight edge are going to be the ones that accumulate a bonus. In this game here, you can see that red has a bonus up in Hokkaido. We can see that yellow has a bonus in the islands, and I think it's I'm not sure the island that purple currently owns, but each one of these players is getting a bonus, so they have more income. The other players will try and get something working. We can see white in the bottom right corner trying to secure a bonus, blue trying to secure bonus on the island in the kind of southwest, but players are just trying to accumulate strength, and they are very, very minimally attacking. Often just a single player at a time. Here you can see black attack once, and that's it. And that's just to secure their card that you get. And other than that, they are trying to get their troop count high, and to avoid elimination by having a high troop count that makes attacking them not an attractive prospect. And this is a really kind of, I think, easy to understand and see example of an instance where going for a bunch of fights is just going to diminish your troop count, and then someone can swoop in, eliminate you. When you eliminate a player, you get their cards, and often this is the critical point. And there are critical points where you turn and burn, but being able to eliminate another player and get their cards, and you can trade in the cards for more troops, often then it becomes worth it and is something that you want to go for. At least in Risk, this is how you play. So let's think of this through the metaphor of Victoria 3 as Risk, or Risk as Victoria 3, whichever you prefer, which is Prussia fighting France over Alsace-Lorraine, which Alsace-Lorraine, it's not worth a very high percentage of France's overall value, although it is probably the most valuable state in France because we do have the Rhine River bonus and a ton of mineral resources. But this is kind of beyond the point of our analysis here, in that we are kind of a little bit more focused on what happens when we consider additional players. Now, if we think of it in terms of chess, it's like winning a pawn, right? But if we think of it in terms of Risk, we don't win a pawn, we give up, 3 points of value, and we go down to 7, and we get the bishop or the knight and the pawn, so France goes down more. But unfortunately, because the war is so expensive, this leaves us less well equipped to be able to fight someone like Great Britain later on, and this gives Great Britain an advantage against us. So now, if Great Britain decides, hey, you're looking weak, and I can dominate you, now they can come in, and maybe they can get a really, really nice sort of battle going on here. Can we... No? Bueller? Okay. So Great Britain might be able to here get a fight where they can only lose 2 value because they have a big advantage, and they can inflict the same kind of pain on us in Prussia, where we are going to lose something that they take, and also lose the 3 points in value from conducting the war, or let's call it strength, and now our power is greatly diminished. And even after conducting this fight, Great Britain, unless France joins in alongside them, Great Britain is still more powerful than France. And so if they accumulate power instead of fighting, this even looks even more exacerbated. Like if we think that Great Britain is instead going to 11 power while France and Prussia are fighting, because they instead focus on ecoing up, then this could get even worse, because then they would be up to something like 9 power. And assuming these are the only players, which is not the case, they would now have a combined total power that is the same as France and Prussia's. In terms of thinking of this in terms of the Risk game, this would be like you having more income or more total troops than the rest of the board combined, at which point you can just go for it. You have a critical turn, and you can just chain together wars repeatedly and just run over the rest of the game here with Great Britain, France, and Prussia. However, the more players you add, the worse exchanging resources becomes, and the worse it is for you to just trade resources in order to gain a slight edge. And if we think that there are other powers at play here, like Russia, then it doesn't make as much sense, or it might not even make sense for Great Britain to make this move where they attack Prussia, although it maybe does, because, we clicked a button there that we shouldn't have, because Russia is there looking scary and ready to attack Great Britain. And so thinking in this way in terms of the war is really expensive and it might not be worth the trade-off, I think is a worthwhile way of considering it. And even in player versus environment, this is a worthwhile way of considering it. Is this going to be an expensive war? And very often it is, and this is one of the reasons why I say you shouldn't really fight GPs, because even if you can fight GPs, the reason you fight them is more for narrative, because however expensive the war is, it's much better to go and beat up people who are weak and to be more colonial mindset oriented, where you're trying to extract resources from the very weakest people on the map. So instead of fighting France as GB, you ignore them and you just colonize Siam or what have you, or go for the South Africa, the very classic sort of example, because in here you don't have to give up your knight to get value. The way that this kind of more operates is you just get +1. You just run over the AI because the AI is so weak, and so instead of even needing to exchange value here, where in terms of thinking, hey, we used 2 power in order to trade with Prussia. If we just don't do this war, and we leave Prussia at 7, this might make sense as there are more and more players, because as more players come in, the value of diminishing someone else in order to increase our strength a little bit decreases. So we might even just leave Prussia at 7 power and just go for some of the Boer states and instead just acquire a little bit more power at ourselves at no expense. And this is how you accumulate an advantage, with the eventual thing you are looking for is either truce juggling these various powers and being able to push them all, which if this is only 4 players and you can truce juggle, then this can be the critical point at which you turn the corner and you fight Russia, you weaken them, and then even post-Russia fight, even if that takes, let's say, 3 points of power out of you, you're still going to be equipped for being able to do the next fight, right? You are still going to have the energy and the budget and the military to be able to turn around and fight Prussia next, and then after that fight France. And so thinking of it in terms of this risk thing where you are looking to get a critical advantage, and then once you have a critical advantage, that's when you turn the corner. And so aggression is very, very low until it gets very, very high. If we skip ahead in this video quite a bit, I imagine there's going to be a singular turn where almost entire players are wiped out. And you can see here, just with a little bit of seeking, we see that Blue has hit a critical point where they could wipe out Purple, and they take Purple's cards, and then with the cards, they are going to be able to buy troops. And with this critical point, they are going to be able to even though they traded a lot of troops on Purple, they can recoup and attempt to fight Red. Now, at this point, Red looks like they're probably too big, and Blue can't really make it up. And because Red is bigger than Blue and Yellow combined, and so it's looking like Red's just going to clear the rest of the table. But this is very much the pattern that we kind of see with these games, in Risk specifically, is that there's a lot of nothing, and then there's one critical turn where you turn and burn. In Victoria 3, this is, you're deciding to chain wars forever. In terms of multiplayer, if you are playing spiky, that is to try and accumulate as much power and win in this type of thing. Alright, so in Magic the Gathering, most of the games are 1v1s, and they're the zero-sum games, much like how chess is, in that anytime you do damage to your opponent, this is good, and this is what you want to do. But there is a format called Elder Dragon Highlander, EDH, or Commander. It has several different names, but in this format, there are 4 players. They each start with 40 life, and the last one standing is the winner. And so you want to be, obviously, the last one standing, and this is an example of how trading resources can be thought of in a little bit of a different way. And so let's kind of talk about the resources just really in a very broad stroke sort of way. The resources you have in a trading card game are cards. And in Magic the Gathering, you could think of them as being in 3 categories. We'd have way more categories if we were making a Magic the Gathering sort of video, but we could think of it as having proactive cards, interactive cards, which prevent other people's proactive cards from working, and then we could think of it as building cards. For here, we'll just think of it as construction, because we're talking about Victoria 3. And we want to spell a long word when we're trying to write it out. So we can think of the cards as being in these 3 categories. And accumulation of more cards would happen in construction. We could think of this as ramping our GDP, right? And we can think of interaction as actually, or we can think of proactive as actually fighting people, and maybe we can think of interactive as building up an army, building up a potential to interact. Really, it's the metaphor doesn't directly translate, but what's critically important about the EDH is that there is a very heavy diplomatic element when this game comes into play, and you are often jockeying for position, and the position you are jockeying for is to simultaneously be in the lead and not seem in the lead, and to try and, much like Risk, hit this critical point where you are so strong that you can afford to fight everyone else and kill everyone at the table simultaneously. And I think of this whenever I'm covering Victoria 3, I think a lot about EDH. And to kind of give a little bit of more texture here, Here's our commander that we like to use in EDH, and this is Xyrus the Writhing Storm, and part of the reason why we like to use this is because certain things are banned in my playgroup or at the local shop, and so I think that this card is really good, but this is a really good diplomatic type of commander, and it has two abilities that are important for us here. Whenever an opponent draws a card, other than the first one that they got in a turn, so whenever they acquire resources, let's say, other than the turn or the card you draw at the beginning of your turn, we get to create a tiny little army, a 1/1 green snake token. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get to draw that many cards, and I get to draw that many cards. And in a zero-sum game, both players drawing cards, that doesn't do anything. That is like the position where we just trade, we trade a bishop for a knight, and the pawn is not taken. It's just tradesies, because if your opponent gets 3 power and you get 3 power, that's not useful. But it's actually pretty useful if we are playing a multiplayer game, because we can think of it like this, and we can decide who to attack. And so let's say we're here with 7 cards in our hand, and 2 other players have 7 cards. So we're at even strength with the other 2 players, all other things equal, just a gross oversimplification. But let's say someone at the table only has 2 cards, right? If we attack them, they get +3 cards, and now we get +3 cards. And now we have created an asymmetry here, but beyond that, we can think of Xyrus, that is the card here, as being a proactive card. It's a card that helps you win, but since it's our commander, we will always have access to it always. It will just cost more to play if our opponents kill it. So they generally don't want to interact with it, or if they interact with it, if they use stuff to destroy it, get rid of it, get rid of our proactive thing, we'll just be able to cast it again, or our commander doesn't cost us a card. And so what we will be able to do here is we will be able to generate an advantage in terms of cards, while simultaneously not really increasing our chances of losing, because the person who's getting stronger is just the weakest person at the table. Also, from a diplomacy perspective, attacking the weakest person at the table and giving them more advantage is generally seen as a good guy type of thing to do, but it's also just the smart thing to do. And so you actually also look like a nicer person, which makes you look like less of a threat. And in general, you do not want to appear to be a threat. This is the second biggest thing that's really, really important in when you're thinking of EDH, because if someone... we do have these cards in hand, but often people don't really think of the cards in hand. Instead, they think of what is on the board, what is on the table, and what do I see, and how scary is it? And so if someone has a lot of things on the table, this leaves you really vulnerable, or it leaves you to be a prime target for an exchange of resources. Now, this doesn't translate necessarily the best in terms of thinking about... Here, let's put... This doesn't translate too well to Victoria 3, but I think it's useful for thinking about resources, is if you're the person with 7 on the table and 7 in your hand, you look way scarier than anyone else at the table. But this 7, it adds up to 14 here, 12 here, and the person across here actually has the same amount of power as us with 2 on the board and 10 in hand, right? If we're thinking of resources in this way. This person looks scarier. And this person's more likely to receive interaction. They are more likely to receive negative feedback from other players because they have stuff on the board that is obvious and apparent. The analog for this, for Victoria 3, is if you are mean to other people in multiplayer, which is obviously something you should be doing at some times, but if you're not getting a good return out of it, this just like ups your threat level. And so you can think of this as your threat level, and keeping this in general low is good. And this is a critical point of deck construction in EDH. Very often, players who are new to the game will make a deck that really commits to the board and looks super threatening, and then it will draw out a bunch of cards from all the other players. So if we think about this player in the top left, they have a really big threat score. And so maybe every other player rather, uses one of their resources to curb down this player, right? And so if we just see a minus of all the resources, and this way we get to curb down the player who's really strong. And so they lose 3 cards if they are trading 1 for 1, or here. Let's put this down here. In this circumstance, now their total power level is 11, right? The total power level here is 11, and 11 here. Now we're tied, but now the most threatening person at the table is going to be the bottom left person. And so you want to be quiet and unassuming in the format, and then just win in a single turn. We're just going to briefly show how the deck that we have wins in a single turn, because I think it might be interesting and instructive, but we are looking to kind of assemble 3 cards. There's other combos, but the prototypical one is getting Xyrus out, and then once we have Xyrus out, we want to cast a spell that is very, very simple. All players discard their hands and draw 7 cards. And this may seem like it's resetting resources, but in general, we have ways to empty our hand faster, that are proactive, that effectively are giving us more construction. And so for us, this is not only a way that we win the deck, or win, it's also proactive. Or sorry, it's not only a way that we win in that it's proactive, it also helps to build us, because often we will have fewer cards when we cast this, and if we have fewer cards when we cast this, the Wheel of Fortune, what will happen is, if everyone has 2 cards in hand, or sorry, everyone has 7 cards in hand, and we have 2 cards in hand, we are effectively +5ing when we cast this. But we pair this, every player discards their hand and draws 7 new cards. But with Xyrus, since each other player, and there are 3 players at the table, drew cards, we will create 21 snake tokens. We then pair this with Perforos, God of the Forge here, and when the key kind of line of text here is, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Perforos deals 2 damage to each opponent. This is the only thing we need to have in play, and it is very, very scary, and the threat level is really high, but when 21 creatures enter the battlefield, each opponent will take 42 damage. Everyone starts with 40 life. It kills all the opponents at the table. It's also indestructible, though, so it's hard to interact with. And so this is part of thinking through Magic the Gathering, is thinking through deck construction and this type of stuff, and seeming not very threatening. But to the extent that this translates over to Victoria 3, attacking people when you are not getting a payout and antagonizing them is kind of like the equivalent of increasing your threat level, which is you are going to attract interaction from your opponents, and you would prefer just to not interact with your opponents and build up a power base so that you can be more equipped for having a critical turn where you are able to attack everyone sequentially or simultaneously. Now, to assign a little bit of percentages, which isn't quite appropriate because a lot of cards do 2 things simultaneously, like Wheel of Fortune is simultaneously for us the equivalent of construction in Victoria 3, and also is proactive, like conducting an effective war. But in terms of how we have decided in Magic the Gathering to kind of allocate our resources is, generally speaking, for our deck, it's 10% proactive, 30 or 40%, let's call it 30% interactive, and 60% construction. And the main idea here is that we want to use our interaction only to prevent other people from winning. And the idea is that we may trade resources with someone, and we may use a card and get 2 of theirs. The problem is it leaves us less fit to fight the rest of the table. I think that this breaks down a little bit in terms of thinking of it in terms of Victoria 3, because you need a deterrent in multiplayer. You need to make it so that attacking you does not look like a good idea, and so that getting war reps from you is going to be bad. And so it's a little bit unlike Magic the Gathering, where you are just sitting on your heels and you are just only interacting with stuff that causes someone to win the game. And because you don't want to trade resources in this way, you don't want to be trading 1 for 1 or even 2 for 1, because it helps the other 2 people at the table. But in Victoria 3, you want to have a big enough army so that you aren't going to be attacked, but you want to have a slightly smaller army than other people, because this is the equivalent of adding construction and ecoing up instead of fighting. If you make a huge army and you don't get to use it, then you will fall behind in terms of construction. Right? But in terms of our deck, it is mainly... we won't really go through it here, and this is also just a shell of the deck, but it's mainly just stuff that helps us find stuff, stuff that is generating resources for us, and very, very few ways in which we actually win the game. And the point is we aren't trying to win the game here so much as we are trying to reach a critical point. We're not trying to win the game as quickly as possible, because often if we will just go for it and try and win the game as early as possible, as we mentioned, we don't like to interact except when we prevent someone from winning the game. If we try and win the game and we haven't set ourselves up for winning the game, everyone at the table is going to try and stop us. So if we, commit 3 pieces of resources to the table, then everyone is going to expend resources to fight us and fight over it. And then we will lose our board. And now we are in a poor position to win because we have 4 resources to everyone's 2. And so we want to be as unassuming as possible, which isn't possible in Victoria 3 because you could look at other factors. But to the extent that you can do it in Victoria 3, it's not picking fights with other people and not making them upset with you. If you make people upset with you, it's going to be difficult, but you're still looking to hit a critical turn. Much like in Risk, where you can afford to dominate everyone simultaneously or sequentially, and this is going to be, in some ways, I think of this as being not all that proactive, right? You are not trying to rumble as much with the other players unless you think you can string together multiple things because of the way in which rewards are, generally speaking, in Victoria 3, not super substantial. In other games, things go a little bit different, and often, or if the Victoria 3 had a completely open rule set, things would go a little bit different. But very often you can't, spend 2 points of resources fighting and then win a ton of resources off of someone. So it's not the case in Victoria 3, generally speaking, where we have the equivalent of, hey, we have 7 resources, and this guy has 6, and he's weaker than us, and we just go and fight him, and we spend 1 resource, and he loses everything, and then we get to assimilate some of his stuff, and we go up to 11. That's often not how multiplayer rule sets really allow stuff, because they don't allow you to take it all. If you can kind of take it all, this would be a good exchange for you. But if you are trading resources, you need to think about how much money goes into your actual war, and whatever you're grabbing, if it's not giving you as much money as went into your war, you need to think of it as you're trading in a zero-sum way. And the more players that are involved for trading in a zero-sum way, the worse it is going to be for you, even if you are damaging the other team more than yourself, or the other player in this multiplayer context more than yourself. Now, in Magic the Gathering, this example breaks down a bit in the case of coordinating with other powers. Because in Magic the Gathering, to the extent that you coordinate, it's really just, we have the ability to do it with our deck specifically. This is not a common type of thing where we can gain or give other people resources in a way that is very proactive ourselves. We can make it so that other players draw cards with Xyrus by attacking them, giving them resources, and this is kind of the way in which you work together. There are certain types of decks that are geared towards giving other players resources, but these decks are just not very good. But this is an example where it is actually good. But if we think about it in terms of Victoria 3, Victoria 3 is a lot different. Victoria 3 is a lot different because you can dogpile. And dogpiling is very strong in multiplayer. And often, I think the most strategic use for dogpiling is if someone's really strong, and you can set up a way in which you can weaken them while simultaneously letting other people get weakened as well, then this is good for everyone. And this is a sort of key difference. And so if the 3, players in that don't have 8 power, or let's make it a more absurd number, right? Let's make it a much larger number. Let's say someone gets really out of control. They have a lot of leverage and power here in the game, and let's say they have something like 13. If everyone works together, and we think of it as, hey, it's more like this, because there is no, in Victoria 3, there's no combo where someone wins the entire game, right? They need to use their armies, and they need to use their resources, and so if there's no, oops, I comboed my 3 cards together, you lose. And so when we think of things from this perspective, you can have something that looks a little bit more like this. Instead of 3 different powers that have 7 power, you have 1 power that has 21. And that can very much go after the 13, but one of the things that I think is like more nuanced is thinking about what happens after this 21 coalition breaks down. In that, if you were to, say, commit fewer resources, which I think gives you... If other players notice you're doing this, it's going to give you a little bit of some negative stuff kind of in the pipeline or in the back end, in that players aren't going to want to coordinate with you. But let's say you commit 1 resource when the rest of your kind of teammates commit 2, and you weaken the top player by a similar amount. This doesn't really translate 1-for-1 trading in Victoria 3 because someone either wins the war or you don't, and in either case, both players lose a lot. And so in this case, let's abstract it in terms of they spent 5 on the war as well, because it was, roughly speaking, evenly matched. Even though it's 13 against 21, having it under 1 banner is a little bit better, and then they lost 7 power worth of strength. Right? So they get knocked down to 6, and then everything changes back, right? We're back to 4 separate players that are not in the process of dogpiling. But by virtue of having traded resources a little bit better, or maybe acquired some more in the peace deal, you're now ahead of the other 2 people, right? And the person you just dogpiled. But not only that, in terms of thinking of it from the threat perspective, the diplomacy perspective, the people who you just worked with are probably less threatened by you, and they're still probably more threatened by the person you dogpiled. And so now you are in a position, or probably the best position at the table, because you look the least threatening and you have the most resources here. You also have a truce with this guy, and so now you can't be dogpiled as easily. With the 2 5 players, right? And this is maybe even a critical position, depending on how things look. If you can make it so that one of the people can't attack you, like let's say you acquired a truce in terms of how you executed the war, you did it in such a way that you had them deck on you, well, now you maybe hit a critical turn where you can go for this guy, and okay, this guy is a little bit strong, but he's still perceived as the threat. Except now maybe your threat level goes up. Something like this. Food for thought in terms of exactly how to execute this. But this relationship of teaming up powers and then separating powers, this is something that doesn't translate to Magic the Gathering, but allows you to deal with very, very big people. And so if you're big, you want to avoid this. And so if you're big, you also want to think about ways in which you can juggle truces. And if you don't want to be threatening for a long period of time and then not hit the critical point. Right? If you appear threatening and you're not at the critical point, you are going to get dogpiled. And so, in terms of like an overarching strategy, you want to minimize the degree to which you look like a threat, but eventually it's going to be too much, and you're going to run the risk of dogpiling. Or you can try and negotiate with other players such that one of them sits out. So if we kind of think our way back into it's 13s and 7s all around, but let's maybe call it 15s and 7s, right? If it's 15s and 7s, and you can convince one person not to dogpile you in theory win the war, right? And we're not talking about tactical execution. Maybe you have a skill issue and the truth really hurts and you can't win against 2 7s. But if the dogpile, and maybe you've just really sold the fact that you're not a threat, and the dogpile only comes in from 2. Right? In that sort of instance, with it just being 14 against 2, right? Or 14 against 15, you maybe have a better chance. And so Diplo takes a much different type of avenue than it does in kind of Magic the Gathering with Victoria 3, because you can combine powers in a sort of effective way to allow yourself to go after the strongest person. But when you go after the strongest person, there's often the aftermath. And I think that, or at least when I've cast multiplayer games, players don't think about the aftermath very much at all. They only think about the winning of the immediate battle in front of them, which is the same type of thinking that I think leads you into being more zero-sum oriented. You got something from them and you won, but really, you're not trying to win wars in Victoria 3, right? You're trying to set up a critical point. More than anything else. You're trying to acquire resources more than you are trying to win wars, because the more resources you acquire, the sooner you reach a critical point wherein you can win all the wars. And so in order to do that, you need to be asking yourself, well, what's this look like at the end of this war? And am I in a position where, relative to the rest of the people in the game, my power level is rising? And or how can I create situations where I will be best suited for this? And it might not even be acquiring the most power yourself, but setting up a situation where someone else looks really scary after the major threat gets severely decapitated, and that you can look for a 2v1. So let's say a situation here, everyone dogpiles this player, and they get kind of wiped out. Now, the person with the 9 is the threat. And so all you have to do, in an instance where we had 7, 8, 9, which is, of course, why 6 was afraid of 7, if we have kind of weaker players at the table here, and one stronger player, and then the 15 gets really dinked down, and we're just thinking of like power level in the abstract, and you have 8 strength, and they have 7 strength, man, oh man, if you can convince the 7 player, as you're the 8 player, to go to war with the 9 because they're the threatening one, then you get to be the threat afterwards, but you have a truce with the 4, right? You'll have a truce with the 9, right? After they're reduced to, let's say, a 3. And so even though you teamed up with them, now you're in perfect shape. And if there's only 4 players and you're stronger, now you can turn, right? You've hit the critical point here where you can turn and burn. And it is, you just don't want to seem like the threat before then, because if you seem like the threat, you are going to set up these types of situations against yourself where 2 powers that are a little bit weaker than you will be incentivized to go after you. And it might be better to play nicer and seem weaker, but just be relatively weaker or relatively stronger compared to who you're teaming up with, such that you put yourself in positions that post-dogpile, you have the best chance of getting a critical point where you can start going after everyone. Because if you win this war, they can't dogpile you, right? Because truce and truce. If you win this war and you reduce them to, let's say, 2, which is, I mean, we're thinking of different numbers here, but now, when this truce is up, you reduce them. And even if you have to give off your power to like do these wars in a row, it doesn't matter, right? Because you're going to get to the point where you're just reducing everyone, right? And you get to dominate the game even though you're trading resources. It is, in a sense, much like hitting the end game in Risk, once you get to this point. And I really do think Risk is a particularly illustrative example, because you are lying in wait in Risk for a majority of the time until you can hit a critical turn, which we're seeing blue have a critical turn. Now, this isn't going to work out for them because red's too strong. Red's acquired too many resources here. But they have a turn where they just get to eliminate purple entirely. They get purple's cards. And this, I think, does translate in terms of metaphor up over to Victoria 3 fairly well. But I hope that this video was interesting. If you guys like this video, especially, or didn't like this video, especially with like the drawing and the talking about stuff that's a bit more abstract and theoretical, please put it in the comments. You know, YouTube algorithm stuff, all that stuff. And other than that, have a good day.